Good morning to folks who are joining. We'll be getting started in just a couple of minutes. Good morning, everybody. We have a lot of people joining us this morning, so we're going to give it a couple of minutes for folks to log in, and then we'll get started. Good morning to those of you who just joined. We still do have a lot of people logging on, so I'm going to give it another couple of minutes and then we'll get going. All right, we still have folks logging in, but we have a lot to cover, so we're going to go ahead and get started. So welcome to this morning's webinar, Completing the FAFSA and CADAA for Youth with Experience in Foster Care or Homelessness. We're really excited to have a lot of folks joining us this morning. So before I get started, I wanted to just say a couple of words about John Burton Advocates for Youth, your host for this morning's webinar. For those who may not be familiar with our organization, we are an advocacy organization that works to improve outcomes for youth who have experience in the foster care system or who have experienced homelessness. We do that through policy advocacy, research, and providing technical assistance and training like this one. And we work across 4 different domains: education, housing, health, and economic security. And this webinar, of course, falls within our education work. And we're happy to have all of you with us today. We can go to the next slide. So a few logistics. We will be recording this webinar. It is being recorded, and it will be posted on our website at jbade.org. We usually get these up within a couple of days, so by end of day tomorrow, the recording should be posted. We will also be sending out the PowerPoint slides along with the recording. We do have closed captioning available, so if that's something that you would like to turn on, you can do that through your own Zoom portal. And you can submit questions through the Q&A. We do have the chat disabled for this webinar because we want to make sure that we can track all the questions that are coming in So please go ahead and use the Q&A. We will be doing our best to respond to questions throughout the webinar. And then if there is time at the end, we'll try to address some of the more common questions that came up. Next slide. Oh, and actually one other thing I'll just say about that is I mentioned that we'll be posting the PowerPoint and this webinar recording. We have several other resources as well that we're going to be talking about at the end of the presentation. So you'll have even more than just this to access. The next slide. So I'm really excited today to be joined by my two colleagues at JBay, Jessica Petras and Sarah Potter. My name is Debbie Rauscher, and we're all with the education team here at JBay. And then we have three folks who are our subject matter experts who are on Q&A duty. So they're going to be working behind the scenes to try to get your questions answered. David Levy and Mark Kantrowitz, who are stunning experts on all things FAFSA and financial aid. We're incredibly grateful to have them here. And Jillian Sajar with Schoolhouse Connection, who is the person in this country who best understands all things homeless student related to the FAFSA. So really excited to have all three of them with us today. We can go to the next slide. So a quick overview of what we're going to be talking about today. Very briefly on why we're having this webinar, why financial aid matters so much. We're going to talk about what's new. People have probably heard that there's a lot changing with the FAFSA. We're going to kind of hit some of those highlights. We're going to walk through how to apply for financial aid, some considerations after the FAFSA or CADAA are submitted, and then go over some helpful resources at the end. Okay, so quickly, why does financial aid matter? Why are we here talking about this? There's an abundance of evidence that financial aid makes a huge difference to students in terms of both whether they enroll in higher education and whether they complete. So a few data points that we just pulled out to make this point. High school seniors who complete the FAFSA are 63% more likely to enroll in higher education than those students who do not. Down at the bottom, you can see some of the impact of receiving financial aid on transfer or graduation rates. So students who received more $7,500 or more, 49% of them in one study transferred or graduated, compared to students who received between $1,000 and $2,500. Only 17% of them transferred or graduated. And then a fairly recent study that came out that looked very specifically at the Chafee Grant, which is a financial aid source specifically just for foster youth that provides up to $5,000. Foster youth who received the Chafee Grant were almost 2.4 times more likely to complete a degree than students who did not receive that funding. So we can really see that receiving financial aid makes a huge difference in student success. Not only does financial aid make a difference, but you make a difference. So you're on this webinar because you work with students in some capacity, or work with people who work with students who have either experienced homelessness or the foster care system. And there's also an abundance of research that having that adult supporter in the life of a young person makes a huge difference in terms of that person's long-term success. So one study found that foster youth who reported receiving a lot of encouragement from adults in their life to continue their education beyond high school had a greater likelihood of completing college. And we see this over and over again in the research, really the power that an adult supporter can have in changing the trajectory of a young person's life. So kudos to you for being here and doing this work, and thank you. Okay, so let's get into kind of the meat a little bit. We're going to start with a high-level overview of some of the changes to the FAFSA. So if we can go to the next slide, throughout the presentation, we will be highlighting some of the more detailed information about things that are new or things that have changed. And you'll see on the slides a little new icon to denote when something is different from previous year's FAFSAs. So this slide here is not in any way a comprehensive overview of the changes. However, I wanted to highlight a few things for folks. So people are probably aware of this, but the FAFSA and CADAA release have been delayed. We're going to talk about what the terms FAFSA and CADAA mean in a minute for those not familiar, but CADAA is the California DREAM Act application, which can be submitted by students who don't qualify for federal aid because of their immigration status, and we'll get into some of the details about that. Has been delayed until December this month. Usually it comes out October 1st. So we don't have an exact date of when it's going to come out. What the Department of Education has said is that it will be released by December 31st. There's a slight possibility it could come earlier than that, but that's the expectation, is it will be out by the end of the month. It is a totally new form, so be prepared to be filling out something that somewhat resembles, but is pretty different from FAFSAs that you may have worked with students to complete in the past. Couple of things I wanted to highlight. So the way that income is calculated has changed, and for the purposes of our students, it really is limited to income that was reported on their taxes. So in past years, the students we work with are independent students. They tend to have very limited income. It's not complicated typically where they're getting their income from, if they have income at all. But in past years, if a student didn't file their taxes, but they had worked, they had to gather up their W-2s or their 1099s and manually input their income information. There was provisions about reporting any in-kind income that they may have received. All of that has gone away. For our students, it really is just about income that was reported on taxes. And if they didn't file a tax return because they weren't required to based on their income levels, then their income is zero. And they don't have to worry about figuring out and manually inputting all that. So that's going to really, that's I'd say the biggest simplification in the FAFSA simplification for our purposes. There are also more options for verifying status for foster and homeless youth. So we're going to walk through those options. That should make it easier for these students to be verified and get their independent status. And then this is really exciting. Foster and homeless status no longer needs to be re-verified every year. So again, that's a huge barrier that has been removed for these populations and should make it easier for them to be able to maintain their financial aid year to year. And then I say, and more, because as I know, we will be highlighting some other changes to the provisions as we walk through the application. So in terms of this webinar, I have a couple of caveats before we jump in. First is we are focusing on independent single students. A lot of the FAFSA presentations that you'll see out there spend a lot of time talking about parents and parental income and how to put parental income in and all of that. We are focusing on a student population that is by definition independent. And so that's the population we are focused on. If you do work with students who don't meet the definition for independence, we do have some resources at the end of the presentation we'll share for getting information about how to manage the parent portions of the FAFSA. We're also focusing on single students. So if you're working with a student who's married, they would have to have their spouse input information. We're not going to be covering that. We're only covering the highlights. This webinar is not going to cover every single step of the FAFSA completion process. As I mentioned, we'll be sharing about other resources that we're going to put together and make available in January. And this is going to include what we call our visual guide, which will include a comprehensive step-by-step screenshots of the entire application. We're not doing that here. Last but not least, information may change. So there's some prototypes and some guidance that we have, but the FAFSA is not out yet. And there may be things that we don't know about or aren't anticipating. And so do check back in January when we publish all of our resources to see whether any information has changed and get updates. So that's just our disclaimer that things could change between now and when the actual FAFSA comes out, but this is the information as we know it currently. With that, I am going to transition over to Jessica.
Thank you, Debbie. So, how to apply for financial aid? Go to the next slide. The first step is to determine which application to complete, and there are two options. The first option is the FAFSA, which stands for the Free Application for Federal Student Aid. And this is an application for US citizens, permanent residents, those are individuals with their green card, or other eligible non-citizens. The eligible non-citizens, you can go to the FAFSA website to see these less common categories if you need to learn more. And to apply, there's a mobile-friendly website at fafsa.gov that's available in both English and Spanish. Also to note, although this is called the application for federal student aid, this application here in California is used to apply for both federal and state financial aid. Now, for those who don't qualify to submit a FAFSA because of their immigration status, the other option to apply is through the California DREAM Act application, also known as the CADAA, and students, because of their immigration status, may be eligible for this application. So this is for students who are undocumented students through Assembly Bill 540 that meet certain eligibility criteria, such as attending California schools for a certain minimum period of time. The CADAA also applies to certain categories of visa holders who can't submit a FAFSA, such as those that have temporary protected status or a U visa. Now, again, you can go to the website, let's list it here on the slide, to learn more information about the eligibility to submit this application. So the website's there, that's where students can apply. I do want to note, though, that the online application for the CADAA is only available in English. When a student fills out the application for a CADAA, they are not eligible for federal financial aid. They're only eligible for state financial aid. However, by filling out this application, they also qualify as a California resident for in-state tuition. Paper versions are also available, both the FAFSA and the CADAA, but we don't recommend it. There can be more errors when a student fills it out via paper. The only time we'd ever recommend someone filling out the paper is in the case of the CADAA, if a student needs a Spanish language version, which is available in paper. Now, for any of you that are working with foster youth that are also undocumented, they may have a pending application for residency, that is to get their green card, through something called Special Immigration Juvenile Status. If that's the case, this application is pending, then they are not eligible for federal financial aid, and they still need to submit their California DREAM Act application until they've received that permanent resident status or that green card. And another thing, just to share in general for all students that are filling out the California DREAM Act application, some students may be hesitant to disclose this information on a state application, and you can reassure them that the information that's submitted in this application is confidential and it's not shared with the federal government. Next slide. So once a student fills out one of these two applications, how does the application work in terms of determining their eligibility for need-based aid? So it uses this formula here on the screen. So first, colleges and universities determine what their cost of attendance is for their institution. And cost of attendance is the total amount it costs to attend college. So that includes tuition, housing, meals, books, transportation. And each institution determines this amount for their college. Next, the FAFSA and the CADAA both ask, a series of questions to determine what is now called a Student Aid Index, or SAI. Now, this used to be called Expected Family Contribution, EFC, for those of you who are familiar with the application from the past. And this is a calculation that's usually based off of the student's income, their assets, and their household size. And the lower the number from this index, the more aid the student is eligible for. The SAI can actually go as low as negative 1,500. In the past EFC, the lowest number was 0, but now the student might have a number as low as negative 1,500. The student's SAI is then subtracted from the cost of attendance to determine their eligibility for need-based aid. That's aid like the Cal Grant or the Pell Grant or the Chafee Grant. Now, something new and exciting to share this year is the Chafee Grant. We're going to talk more about this later on in the presentation. This is a grant for eligible foster youth. This is now excluded from the calculation of eligibility for unmet need starting in 24-25. So this means if a student receives the Chafee Grant, they can receive these funds above and beyond the cost of attendance, which is good news. Next slide. So when to apply? The priority application period is typically October 1st through March 2nd, before the start of the school year that they plan to attend college. However, because of the delay of the FAFSA, this year's deadline has been extended to April 2nd. Now, students can apply after April 2nd, they just may receive less money. And CSU and UC students, they must submit by this deadline in order to get the Cal Grant and the middle class scholarship. Now, students planning on attending a California community college, the deadline for that has not changed. They still have until September 2nd to apply, but we do encourage them to apply as soon as possible to qualify for, the maximum aid possible, but also so that they can receive their aid before the start of the school year. Now, if you're working with any students who are planning to attend a private college or out of state, those colleges may have different priority application deadlines, so you'll want to look into what that college's deadline is. And also to keep in mind that students can actually apply for financial aid before they even know where they plan to attend or before they even submit college applications. So they could start the process as soon as the FAFSA opens. So once the student knows where to apply and when, the first step for our students who are completing their FAFSA is to create what's called an FSA ID. That stands for Federal Student Aid Identification. And this is essentially them creating a username and password for their account. So there will be some changes made to the new FSA ID, and the new FSA ID is scheduled to launch at the same time as the new FAFSA. However, the good news is that people can actually create an FSA ID now using the old FSA ID. If they do, though, they'll just have to go through some steps to verify their phone number and email address that they use to provide in that application, or use what's called an authenticator app once the new application opens, hopefully by December 31st. Now, you do need to, we'll go back just a little bit. What is also new is that you now need to create the FSA ID in advance of doing the FAFSA, because it could actually take a few days to process. And the FSA ID is now used to match to the student's tax information, which I'm going to share more about on the next slide. So in the past, we'd have a lot of times students would sit down, fill out their FSA ID, fill out their FAFSA. Now we're really recommending that they fill out that FSA ID in advance before they sit down and fill out their FAFSA. And to do that, they can either go to the launch page, we have that website listed on the slide, or when they go to FAFSA.gov and go to log in, they can create an account and just click on that button there, and it'll take them to that page as well. To create the FSA ID, in the past, you could either do it with an email address or phone number. Now, an email address is required in addition to their Social Security number in order to be eligible for federal student aid. In the past, again, that email address was optional. A phone number can be provided. It's not required, but it is recommended. You also want to make sure that students enter their name exactly as it appears on their Social Security card to prevent any errors. And lastly, make sure to work with students to create a system to safely store their username and password. They're going through a lot, probably during their senior year, so help them figure out how to save that information to access it later. Now, if you're working with any students that don't know their Social Security number, if you're working with a foster youth, you can have them call their county's child welfare department or their independent living program for assistance. And you're working with any students experiencing homelessness, they can reach out to their high school counselor or homeless youth liaison for assistance with this process. Now, if you're working with a student who just doesn't have a Social Security number, they should not be filling out the FAFSA, they should be filling out the California DREAM Act application. Next slide. So here are a list of things that the student needs to apply through these applications. Students can now list up to 20 colleges, whereas in the past it was only up to 10 colleges in their application. And as before, the student can go back in and add additional colleges after their application has been submitted and processed. As we shared, they'll need their FSA ID login if they're filling out the FAFSA. Another thing is their statewide student identifier number. Now, this is a unique number that's given to individual students within California's public K-12 system. It's not required, but it is recommended for our CADAA applicants. Also, for CADAA applicants, they may be asked to provide their ITIN, their individual taxpayer identification number. And this is something that an undocumented immigrant would obtain in order to file a federal income tax return. This again is an optional field and may not pertain to all the students that you're working with. They'll also be asked about information about current assets, such as in their cash checking accounts or saving accounts. And there is a very limited scenario in which a student would need a copy of their tax return on hand to complete the application, but we'll discuss more about that in the next slide. All right, so as Debbie mentioned, a new process is in effect now in terms of verifying the student's income. So these applications look at income information from the prior year. So if we're working with a student that's applying for the 2024-2025 school year, they'd be asked information from 2022. This new process is called Federal Tax Information, FTI. This replaces what was used in the past, which was the data retrieval tool. So now this is a big change. Students must approve and provide consent to importing data from the federal tax information in order to be eligible for federal student aid. And they even have to provide approval even if they did not file a tax return. It's also our understanding that students who did not file a tax return will no longer be required to provide a verification of non-filing letter from the IRS. We haven't seen official guidance on this yet, but that's what's been communicated to us. So that would be really good news that they don't have to fill out an additional form. So as I mentioned before, having a copy of the student's tax return, it's only needed if the student receives scholarships during the requested year. So in this case, we're talking about 2022, that they reported on their tax information. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later on as we get to the financial section as well. Now, if you're working with a student whose income or their circumstances have significantly changed since they filed their taxes in 2022, they should contact their financial aid office to request an adjustment to that income that's used to calculate their eligibility for financial aid. Next slide. The students then asked about their college or career school plans, and they'll first be asked what their college grade level will be when they begin the 24-25 school year. Now, all first-time students should select first-year freshmen as the option. If you're working with any students who took dual enrollment courses in high school, they should still select that first-year freshman button. Now, if you're working with returning students, just keep in mind that it's not based on the number of years that the student is enrolled. It's actually based on the units completed towards that degree or certificate that they're working towards. So if you're working with a full-time student, they might attain second-year grade level after 1 year of study. But if you're working with a half-time student, it would take them 2 years to reach that level. So it's going to be looking at their coursework, not the years completed. Now over to Debbie.
All right, thank you so much, Jessica. All right, so we're going to transition over to talking about the student personal circumstances question. So this is a really important part of the FAFSA for the students that we work with, because this is what determines whether they're considered independent students. We've already used this term several times. What it means to be independent is that the student does not have to provide any information about their parents. So obviously it both makes filling out the FAFSA much easier, and it also qualifies them typically for more aid if they're not having to consider parental income in the calculation. There's a couple of changes to this question now from the previous FAFSA. It used to be that the form used what's called skip logic. So if a student qualified under one particular status for independent status, for example, they were married or they had children, they wouldn't be asked the other questions that are the basis for determining independent status. That has changed, and all students are now going to be asked these questions, which is great for those of you who use FAFSA responses to help identify students who might be eligible for other programs on your campus for foster youth or homeless youth. you'll now have access to that information for all students who complete the FAFSA or CADAA. In addition, the student can select all that apply. So they're not limited to just selecting one of these options to establish their independence. So if we can go to the next slide. So this is a screenshot of the questions that are specifically relevant to youth who have been in the foster care system. Now, one interesting thing is there used to be a single question that said, at any time since the student turned 13, were they an orphan, a ward of the court, or in foster care? And you check the box if any of those applied. Those have now been split out into 3 separate questions. So one question, were they an orphan? Another question, were they a ward of the court? And another question, were they in foster care? We have had some communication with the Department of Education to try to get clarity as to how they're defining ward of the court versus in foster care. Certainly in California, those terms are often used synonymously. We haven't gotten any clarification from them, and I don't expect that we will. So I would say that for students who are in foster care, they can check either or both of those boxes to qualify. Also, just to note a terminology thing here in California. In California, we don't often use the term ward of the court. We usually talk about students who are dependents of the court or in dependency status. Ward of the court is actually a term in California that's often used to refer to youth who are under the jurisdiction of the probation system. So the terminology can be a little confusing, but if the student was in foster care, that's essentially what this is referring to. Note that they have to have been a dependent at some point after they turn 13. So if a student, say, has reunified with their biological parents at age 11 and they don't at any point re-enter the foster care system, they wouldn't be able to qualify as independent. But if they exit to reunification, to guardianship, to adoption, to any of those at any point after their 13th birthday, they can check that box and qualify as independent. I will just note something about youth under the jurisdiction of probation, because here in California, we do have youth who are considered dependents who are in the foster care system, but are supervised by the probation system. As with all things, those students are foster youth. They qualify for any and all benefits that any other foster youth would qualify for, including independent status. Now, if a youth is solely involved in the juvenile justice system and has been either remained at home with parents or was incarcerated in a locked facility like a juvenile hall or juvenile camp, those students are not considered ward of the court. Note that they can check the box if they were in foster care for as little as a single day. There's no minimum amount of time they needed to have been in foster care after the age of 13 to qualify. And they do have to have lived in some form of out-of-home placement after their 13th birthday to qualify. I'll also note the guardianship criteria. So a student has to have been in legal guardianship when they turned 18 in order to meet the criteria for independent status under the legal guardianship criteria. This does include students who were in a legal guardianship both with kinship, referred to here in California as the KIN-GAP program, or a legal guardianship with a non-related person, referred to as non-related legal guardianship. So all of those qualify. We can go to the next slide. So how does a youth verify their status as a foster youth? As has been the case for a number of years now, there is a portal within the WebGrants system here in California. This is just state specific, that allows a financial aid officer to go in, look up a student's name, and verify that there's been a match with the Department of Social Services record. And they can just look that up and see, yes, there was a match, and that counts as verification. The student shouldn't be asked to bring in any additional verification if that match is successful. Sometimes there's problems with the match. It doesn't always happen correctly. Some financial aid officers maybe aren't aware of that option. And so in some cases, foster youth could be asked to bring in an actual letter to verify their foster care status. I'm going to talk in the next slide about who can provide this verification. But once they do bring in either that letter or they're verified through the data match, as we mentioned before, that does not need to be redetermined if they remain at the same institution in subsequent years. We recommend for those of you who are working with high school students to help students get that ward of the court verification letter before they leave high school, and have them keep it in a safe location, because that's a letter that they'll potentially need not just for financial aid, but for other programs as well. If you are working with a young person who needs to get a foster youth verification letter, if they're currently in the foster care system, they should contact their social worker or their county's independent living program. If they exited the foster care system, they can call the Office of the California Foster Care Ombudsperson. We do have the phone number on the slide there. If you Google it, you'll also find their website, and there are ways to request those letters through the website as well. It's a pretty simple process. In terms of who can provide verification, if we can go to the next slide. The entities that are authorized to provide verification has been expanded as a result of the FAFSA Simplification Act. The financial aid administrator must accept verification from any of the entities listed on this slide. So that includes a court order or other official state documentation, verification of eligibility for a Chafee Grant. We've mentioned the Chafee Grant a couple of times. We'll be talking more about that. But if they have qualified for the Chafee Grant, that constitutes verification. And then a phone call, written statement from any of these entities listed. The phone call option is new, as well as a number of these entities. So an attorney or the CADAA, the Court Appointed Special Advocate, the foster care placing agency, so like a foster family agency or FFA, can provide that verification. A state Medicaid agency, that's probably not that common here in California, or of course the county agency itself. Also, if there's a financial aid administrator who documented the student's circumstances previously at a different institution, that financial aid administrator can provide that documentation to another college in order to verify status. Go to the next slide. So that's for foster youth. I'm going to talk now about unaccompanied homeless students. So after the student gets asked the questions about personal circumstances, they will get asked the question at any time on or after July 1st, 2023, was a student unaccompanied and either homeless or self-supporting and at risk of being homeless. What do those terms mean? So unaccompanied means not in the physical custody of a parent or guardian. If a student is homeless, but is homeless with their parents, then that student is not considered unaccompanied and is not independent. They would have to provide the income information from the parents. Homeless means lacking fixed, regular, and adequate housing. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that definition with the next slide. And then there's this concept of self-supporting and at risk. So self-supporting means the student pays for all of their living expenses. And at risk of being homeless is defined as that the student's housing may cease to be fixed, regular, and adequate. The example that is typically given is a student is being evicted and they have not identified any housing to move into once the eviction is finalized. Next slide. So lacking fixed, regular, and adequate housing, what does that mean? It is, for those of you who maybe work in the K-12 system, you're probably familiar with this definition. This is the McKinney-Vento definition that's established in federal law. It means it can include a variety of folks, including those who are staying with other people temporarily due to the loss of housing, economic hardship, or a similar reason. Basically couch surfing. So that's one of the key things to understand about this definition is it does include students who are couch surfing, as well as those who are living in motels, hotels, who are in shelters, who are sleeping in their car or sleeping outside, or as they say, someplace not normally meant for human habitation. Next slide. Who can, okay, so then let's say the student checks off yes. They say, I do meet the definition of a homeless student. They're then asked whether they have a determination from a list of entities. So big change here from previous years in that there are now additional entities that can provide that formal determination. I think most crucial one being an emergency or transitional shelter, street outreach program, drop-in center, or other programs serving those experiencing homelessness. So pretty much any kind of program that serves homeless individuals can now provide that determination to a student, in addition to the student's high school or school district liaison, that's the McKinney-Vento liaison, director of a federal TRIO or Gear Up program, or a financial aid administrator from another institution. So if the student has a determination from one of these entities, they would check that box. Now, a few things I want to say about this. First of all, financial aid administrators must accept this documentation. So if the student has a determination from one of these entities, unless the financial aid administrator has what they say documented conflicting information, they have to accept it. There's no professional judgment about whether they believe that that determination is adequate or not. As I mentioned before, the determination doesn't need to be redone every year unless the student informs the institution that circumstances have changed or the institution has specific conflicting information. Whenever possible, students should get a determination from one of these sources. There is an option that I'm going to talk about on the next slide for having the financial aid administrator make the determination, but it will make the student's life easier if they can get this determination from one of these entities and they just have that in hand when they submit their FAFSA. If, however, the student cannot get a determination from any one of the listed entities, they would check the box, none of these apply. And then if we go to the next slide, they then receive this notice on the screen that they're considered provisionally independent, meaning that they can continue to complete the FAFSA as an independent student, but before their financial aid will be finalized, they have to go meet with the financial aid office to get a determination from the financial aid administrator about their homeless status. The financial aid administrator in this circumstance must make a determination for the youth, and they can make that determination based on a written statement or documented interview with the student. So a lot of students don't have any third party who necessarily knows that they were homeless or can provide a written verification of that. The financial aid administrator must make the determination in that circumstance based on a statement or documented interview. The student would describe what their living circumstance is, and if it meets the criteria for homeless, then that student would be determined to be a homeless student. Also, the determination must be based on the legal definition of homeless and unaccompanied, and cannot take into consideration the reason why the student is homeless. So if that student is sleeping in their car, they're homeless, and the financial aid administrator is not allowed to ask, well, why did you leave your parents, and what was going on there, and is there a reason you can't go back? And they can't dive into that kind of information if the student meets that legal definition. Okay, so what if the student is not in foster care, and if we can go to the next slide, does not meet the definition of homelessness? There is another way that a student can be determined to be independent, which is called student unusual circumstances. So the student will be asked this question: do unusual circumstances prevent you from contacting your parents, or would contacting your parents pose a risk to the student? And there's some examples that are given there: left home due to an abusive environment, they have been abandoned by their parents, have refugee or asylee status, or a victim of human trafficking, they're incarcerated, or their parents are incarcerated, or they're otherwise unable to contact or locate their parents. If they believe that they have these types of unusual circumstances, then they can answer yes. And there's a note here, and this is important to note, that if those circumstances have led to them being homeless, they can just qualify as homeless and check the box for homeless and not have to worry about any of this. But if they're not homeless, they're stably housed, but they just don't have contact with their parents for one of these types of reasons, they can check yes. They will be considered provisionally independent, again, meaning that they'll be able to complete the FAFSA as an independent student, but it won't be finalized until they meet with their financial aid officer and verify their unusual circumstances. I will note that there is more room for professional judgment in the unusual circumstances category than, say, in the homeless category, where there's very strict criteria. The financial aid administrator does have a lot of leeway in deciding whether they think the student's circumstance qualifies as one of these types of unusual circumstances that would allow them to submit as an independent student. And with that, I'm going to transition it back to Jessica.
Great. So now we're going to move into the demographics section of the application, and students are asked a series of questions. They're asked questions about gender, including if they are non-binary or transgender, questions about race and ethnicity, questions about citizenship status. And remember, if they're not a US citizen, they would, or eligible non-citizen, they'd be completing the CADAA. They're also asked questions about parent education status, if a parent was killed in the line of duty, and high school completion status. Go to the next slide. We have some tips on how to answer these questions. So students can select prefer not to answer to those questions about gender, race, ethnicity, and also parents' education status. And it does not impact their eligibility for aid in any way. Now, also to keep in mind, the answers to the questions about gender and race are also not shared with the colleges or other federal agencies. They're just for research purposes only. So you may want to share that information with students as well. Now, before getting to the questions about gender and identity, let's keep in mind that for some students, this may not be information that they feel safe to share, or it may not be information that they have yet shared with any adult supporter. And so given the sensitive nature of these questions, we really recommend using it as an opportunity to proactively let students know that this is a safe space and that you're affirming of that student's identity. You might simply say, hey, this is a safe place. This is a safe space. I'm an LGBTQ ally, or I want you to know I'm supportive of all gender identities and expressions. And taking the time to do this might help to also, strengthen the relationship with the student or create opportunities for future conversations. When you get to the questions about citizenship status, if a student is an eligible non-citizen, they will be asked here to enter their alien registration number. And if the student completed high school, we do recommend that they use the search function to find their high school, just to make sure that it's entered correctly and there aren't any errors with entering it manually. When asked about high school completion status, there's a few options, including if they were homeschooled or if they received a high school equivalency certificate, that's a GED or HiSET, and students that select those options are also eligible for aid. Next slide. So now into the financial section, which has been greatly simplified from the prior application. It starts off with a question about if the student has received any federal benefits. Now you'll see on the screen that it says responses don't affect federal student aid eligibility. However, there are benefits to disclosing this information, and students should be encouraged to check all the boxes that do apply to them if they are receiving any federal benefits. Essentially, if they do check off those boxes, it may make the student exempt from having to report any information about their current assets, like what's in their checking or their savings accounts. Keep in mind, though, that the federal names of the benefits are oftentimes very different than the names we use locally here in California. So students may not be familiar with these terms and realize that it might be some benefit that they're actually receiving. So for example, Medicaid is the federal name for Medi-Cal. SNAP is the federal name for CalFresh, and TANF is the federal name for CalWorks. So this might be an opportunity to let students know the different names for these benefits. Next slide. So we talked earlier about how income information is now automatically imported from the IRS through the new federal tax information process. However, the FAFSA does have a few questions about 4 special types of income. Now, 3 of these questions, we're not going to cover them now. They're extremely unlikely to be relevant to the students that we're serving. But one of these questions asks them about the amount of college grants, scholarships, or AmeriCorps benefits that are reported as income to the IRS. Now, if the student had any of these sources of income from the prior year, which would be 2022, and they included that information on their 2022 tax return that has now been imported into the FAFSA, they want to report that on the FAFSA and share that information. And that's because that amount will be deducted from the student's total income, and it could actually result in eligibility for more aid. When you look at the slide and the question here, it says optional. So again, making sure students know that even though it says optional, if this applies to them, we do recommend that they provide that information. Next slide. Student assets. So this section, again, has been greatly reduced. Now, these are the only questions the students asked about their assets. So essentially, if it's not asked, if it's not on this section, then it does not need to be reported. One of the questions is about the current total of cash, savings, and checking accounts that they have. What's important to keep in mind for this one is that financial aid received, such as if they just got grants or scholarships, does not need to be reported if that information is currently in their checking or savings account. So let's say you're working with a student, they just received their aid disbursement for the spring semester, they just got $10,000 in grants that's sitting in their bank account. That $10,000 does not need to be included in their asset total. Now, some students, as we mentioned before, might be exempt from having to provide their asset information if they select one of the questions in the prior section about receiving federal benefits, but the FSA hasn't released details about what this question would look like, so we don't have a screenshot to provide. They're also asked questions about current net worth of investments, about real estate, businesses, investment farms. I think something to just let students know is that when they're being asked questions about assets, this does not include the value of a car or a computer. Next slide. Students are then asked which colleges they want the information from their FAFSA or CADAA sent to. And as we mentioned before, they can now select up to 20 colleges to have this information sent to. They only have to enter at least one. After the application is processed, and I'm going to talk more about that because there are some delays with that with the new FAFSA, but after their application is processed, if they want, they can go back into the application, they can remove the colleges listed, and they can add up an additional 20 colleges, and they can repeat this process as many times as necessary, and the original college will receive that information. Now, what's different is that students are no longer asked about their housing plans. However, their housing plans, whether they're living off campus or on campus, it does impact the calculation for the cost of attendance and ultimately how much aid the student is eligible for. Colleges now must determine the housing status from their own records to figure this out from students, since it's not a question on the FAFSA anymore. So they might get that information by seeing, who paid a housing deposit. Many colleges with on-campus housing, what we're hearing is that they may be providing an initial financial aid award offer based on the assumption that the student's living on campus, and they might have a caveat that says, okay, well, your offer may change if the student doesn't end up living on campus. Or what we're also hearing that some colleges are doing that are more non-residential, like many of our community colleges, is that they're basing the aid offer off of the assumption of living off campus, which is generally the highest cost option. And some colleges, we're hearing they're putting this question into their applications, or some colleges are sending out a questionnaire after the student accepts their offer of admission. So things are changing with this process due to the new application. Next slide. Okay. So after the student submits their application, they get a confirmation page saying, great, you filled out your application. And on there is their estimated student aid index, their SAI. And this again is used just to provide an estimate of their eligibility for federal student aid. It's not, exactly how much money they're going to be receiving. But due to the changes with the new FAFSA, there are some delays. So typically what happens is a student submits their application, then they also get what's called a FAFSA submission summary indicating that their FAFSA was processed, and they usually get that within 1 to 3 days. But now applications that are submitted in January may not receive their FAFSA submission summary until as late as February. So instead of the typical processing time being 1 to 3 days, it may be up to a month. But we have heard that come February, they should be receiving that back at their normal time of 1 to 3 days. There are going to be implications with this. What we've heard is that colleges may be sending out their award offers a month later than usual since this is being delayed. And then again, students will have to wait until their application is processed to go back in and make corrections, like with selecting how many colleges or any other changes they want to make to the application. So at least for applicants in January, they probably will have to wait about a month before they can go back in and make those edits and changes. All right, well, now I'm going to turn it over to Sarah.
Thank you so much, Jessica. So I know that was a lot of information and you're still digesting, but I want to remind folks that filling out the FAFSA or the CADAA is just the first step. And there's a lot that students need to do after they complete and submit their application to ensure that they maximize the amount of aid that they receive. So I wanted to quickly talk about the Chafee Grant or the Chafee Education and Training Voucher, as you may have heard it referred to as in the past. So the Chafee Grant has a maximum annual award amount of $5,000 that eligible students can receive until the age of 26. This award is portable, meaning that students can use it both in-state and out of state, depending on where they plan on attending school. In order to qualify for the Chafee Grant, the student must be a current or former foster youth who was a dependent or ward of the court living in out-of-home foster care at least 1 day between the ages of 16 to 18. They may receive this funding up to $5,000 for up to 5 years, whether or not those are consecutive years until the age of 26. And they must be enrolled at least half time. So in order to apply for the Chafee Grant, a separate application is required. However, applicants only need to apply once. So this application is for first-time applicants only. They must also submit a FAFSA or CADAA. You can see the link here on the screen on where they would go to submit their Chafee Grant. It's on the CSAC website listed here. Students can apply as soon as possible. This application did open on October 1st, so it is ready to go now. Students who are eligible do not need to wait until the FAFSA or CADAA forms are released at some point this month. They can do this now. They will have to make sure that they include their planned school of attendance. It refers to one college the student plans to attend. If the school isn't listed, particularly if it's a school that's out of state, it might not be in the database or the system yet, the student should contact the California Student Aid Commission. And I want to mention as well that depending on the availability of funding, students may be waitlisted to receive this, but even if they are waitlisted, they do not need to resubmit an application. They only have to submit that application once. So after they submit the FAFSA, it's really critically important that students create a WebGrants for Students account. You can see the link here where they would go to set that up. They do need to wait 1 to 2 weeks after their FAFSA is submitted, since it requires some processing time in order for all that information to get relayed to the Student Aid Commission and for the student to be able to create a WebGrants for Students account. But after a week or two, they should go on and create a WebGrants account, which is where they can manage their financial aid and respond to any questions about their applications or provide any sort of incomplete or missing information. So for students who have any difficulty setting up this account or accessing their WebGrants for Students account, CSAC does have a student support hotline. You can see that information here on the screen, and that is who the student should reach out to if they run into any issues establishing this account or accessing an account that they created previously. So once they are in WebGrants and they have their account set up, there's a couple things that they should do. The first is check their award status and amount for the Cal Grant, the Middle Class Scholarship, and the Chafee Grant. They should verify if they have any pending items or forms that need to be completed. They should confirm that the school of attendance is accurate, meaning the school that the student plans to attend college. They should also verify that their high school GPA has been submitted and received by the California State Student Aid Commission. This high school GPA is used to determine their eligibility for the Cal Grant. So if that GPA is not submitted and has not been received by CSAC, the student should contact their high school counselor or CSAC to figure out and troubleshoot how to get that GPA uploaded. They should also enter their high school graduation date. This will become available on the first month of their planned graduation month. So once they enter May or June, or when they anticipate that they'll be graduating, they can go back into WebGrants and enter the exact date. And then lastly, if the student applied for a Chafee Grant, they should check their Department of Social Services record, and they should make sure that that is complete and that their foster youth status has been verified, or if there's any sort of concerns or issues with that verification that would require further action on their part. On this screen, you can see an example of what a student would see when they log into WebGrants and check their award status. So if the award status is pending, students should click on their to-do list to determine next steps or any actions that they need to take. If the award status is not awarded, they should check or click on reason to determine why and learn more. From here, they should likely consult with their financial aid office or CSAC if they believe there was an error. I also have an example screen that shows the award screen for the Chafee Grant. This is where students can verify that their foster care status was confirmed and that data match between the California Department of Social Services and the Student Aid Commission occurred and was complete. So here on the bottom, you can see that it says complete your foster care eligibility certificate form. And so this often pops up if there is an issue with the match. They'll see this link to complete this form, and they have to essentially give additional information to CSAC to help them complete the match with CDSS. It just means that there just wasn't enough information on CDSS's side or CSAC's side to complete it. So they have a form there for the students to manually complete and submit. One thing I do want to note under status here is that while this is a match that happens on somewhat of an automated basis, it only happens monthly. So it might show as incomplete for some time while that match is pending, and it does not, appear immediately. So this could take some time to reflect in WebGrants. However, if they do see this complete your foster care eligibility certificate form, they should complete it. It likely means that there was an issue with that match. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about, since we've spent a lot of time talking about how to maximize financial aid by correctly completing financial aid applications, one thing that a lot of students and a lot of adult supporters don't realize is that in order to keep that financial aid, students have to meet what's called satisfactory academic progress once they begin their college coursework. And so satisfactory academic progress, or SAP, as we have come to call it, are federal regulations and statutes that essentially require students that are receiving federal financial aid to progress in their academic programs in a timely manner. And so if students don't meet these SAP standards for 2 consecutive terms or 1 academic year, many of them will lose their eligibility for federal financial aid. And while these are federal standards and they are directly linked to federal financial aid, such as the Pell Grant and student loans, even work study, they are also linked to our state-funded financial aid, including the Cal Grant. So when a student loses their financial aid due to SAP, they lose most, if not all, of their financial aid with very limited exceptions. I'm not going to go very deep into what the SAP standards are, but essentially they include a minimum GPA, which is often set at a 2.0. They also require students to successfully pass the majority of the classes that they attempt. and that they also complete their degree in a reasonable time frame. We have a lot of resources on SAP on our website, which we'll be sure to include in the chat. But it's really important that students and their adult supporters really take a time to look at the SAP policies at the institutions where the students are planning to enroll, so they know exactly which standards they're going to be held to. Making sure also that they are referred to the appropriate academic counseling and support services to ensure that they are registering for the proper classes and that they have a balanced course load. Also making sure that they talk to advisors and reach back out for academic counseling and support if they are considering withdrawing from any classes, as this can have really detrimental impacts on their SAP standing. If students don't meet SAP, they do have the option to appeal to have their financial aid reinstated on a limited basis. So making sure that students, again, know about that appeals process and are informed about their institution's specific appeals processes and deadlines, and what they need to do to submit and complete an appeal. And then lastly, making sure that students are connected to resources early. One of the best things we can do is just make sure students never end up on financial aid ineligibility due to SAP. We want to make sure that they stay in good SAP standing, and that takes a lot of sort of proactive outreach and monitoring. So making sure that students are touching base, that you're really staying in communication with them, trying to get in early before grades are finalized or before midterms and finals happen, and just providing as much proactive support and encouragement as you can. And so from there, I'm going to turn it back to Jessica to talk about some of our expanded financial aid resources for foster youth.
Thanks, Sarah. So we're very excited to share that there's been an expansion of financial aid for foster youth, and want to make sure folks are aware of what this aid looks like. If we go to the next slide. So the first expansion was to the Student Success Completion Grant. Now this has been in existence for all students, but now for eligible foster youth, they're able to receive additional funding through this award. Now the Student Success Completion Grant, it's administered by our California community colleges, and this new funding just went into effect this fall term in fall 2023 for the 2024 academic school year. To receive this funding, there's no additional application required. But what this grant does is that for eligible foster youth, they can get an award of up to $5,250 per semester if enrolled in 12 or more units. Now, for non-foster youth, they can receive an award of $1,298 per semester if they're taking 12 to 14 units, and $4,000 per semester if they're taking 15 units. So to be eligible for this financial aid, foster youth is defined as someone whose dependency was established on or after the age of 13. They also, as I mentioned, have to be enrolled in 12 or more units. They have to be eligible and receiving the Cal Grant B or C. They also have to be a California resident or meet non-resident tuition exemptions. Those are essentially the same requirements for the California DREAM Act application. And as Sarah mentioned, once they receive that financial aid, they have to meet SAP standards to continue to be receiving that aid. And there is no age cap. So any of your students of any age, if they meet this criteria, they're eligible for this expanded financial aid. We have a fact sheet that we put together for this grant as well as the next grant, which I'm going to talk about on the next slide. So if you want to learn more, you can go to that link to see a very detailed FAQ. And what I'll mention too, since, as we said, no additional application is required, but the college has the responsibility of identifying these foster youth, determining who's eligible, and then providing these awards. So if you're working with any students that you think were eligible, they meet this criteria, but they didn't receive that award, I would really encourage them to reach out to their financial aid office to check in and see what may be happening. It's possible that maybe this college missed them, they didn't show up on a list, and the student may want to be able to provide manual verification of their foster care status in order to receive this aid. Next slide. The other expansion was to the middle class scholarship for foster youth. Now, unlike other types of grants and scholarships, the award amounts for the middle class scholarship vary college to college and student to student because it's based on each college's cost of attendance. And for independent students, for context, in 23-24, the middle class scholarship provided about 36% of the remaining unmet need after accounting for other federal and state and institutional aid and a self-help contribution of $7,898. However, for our eligible foster youth, 100% of the remaining unmet need is funded for them after, again, accounting for other aid that they've received and that self-help contribution of $7,898. So essentially, if the student has unmet need greater than $7,898, they will be awarded the full amount towards that cost of attendance. Now, to be eligible for the middle class scholarship, this is essentially for low to middle income students that are undergraduate students, working towards their bachelor's degree at a CSU, UC, and even a California community college. There are a few California community colleges that do have bachelor level programs, although not that common. Similarly, with the Student Success Completion Grant, foster youth is defined as someone whose dependency was established on or after the age of 13. And to receive this grant, they have to submit their FAFSA or CADAA by the priority deadline. So we talked about typically that's March 2nd. This year it's April 2nd. They do also have to be a California resident or meet the non-resident tuition exemptions. They still have to meet SAP standards. And as with the prior grant as well, there is no age cap, but with this award, they can receive it for up to 4 years, depending on their educational level, or up to 5 years if they're working on a teaching credential. This funding as well just went into effect for the 23-24 school year. The funding just went out, the supplemental funding for foster youth just went out in this fall term last month. Now, the way this financial aid works is through an automated data match with CDSS. So CSAC gets that match, identifies their eligible foster youth, and then should have issued the award. Again, with data matches, sometimes there can be an error. Again, if you're working with a student that you think should have received this grant, they meet the criteria based on their time in foster care, we would encourage them to reach out to the California Student Aid Commission, and there's a form they can complete to provide manual verification of their foster care status to receive this aid. And again, we have a fact sheet where you can learn more about this financial aid and the Student Success Completion Grant. So this money for our youth in the foster care system starts to add up. And so this that we have on the slide is just a sample award package the student might receive if they're attending community college full-time, taking 12 or more units. I just want to acknowledge that we are aware, of course, there's much more resources, unfortunately, for foster youth than for students experiencing homelessness. But we did want to make sure folks were aware of how this funding can add up for both populations. And this can be great information to share with students who might be hesitant to enroll in college due to their concerns around college affordability. So for foster youth, again, if they're, this is just an example, if they're full-time attending community college, when you add it all up, the federal aid, the Cal Grant Access Award for foster youth, the Chafee Grant for foster youth, if they're taking that Student Success Completion Grant, it can add up to about $33,000, which can be pretty game-changing support for a lot of our students. And for our homeless students, that can add up to about $14,000. So make sure you have this information as you're advising students and they're trying to think about what path is best for them, and their options for attending higher education. So we want to leave you, we've got a lot of resources coming your way. Here at JBay, we have a lot of comprehensive resources for students experiencing homelessness, for youth involved in the foster care system. We're in the process of updating all these materials, but we will have them all ready to go and released in early January. One of those resources is our financial aid guide, and this is going to be available in English and Spanish. And this gives you everything you need to know about the different types of financial aid, common steps and how to fill out the applications, key steps after the application, how to maintain financial aid. And there is also a comprehensive list of private scholarships that students might also want to apply for additional aid as well. So we will have the English version ready in probably just a few days, and the other materials, again, will be ready by early January. We'll also have our visual guides for both the FAFSA and the California DREAM Act application, and those will have screenshots of every single question on the application with detailed instructions on how to answer those questions. So if you're not feeling that confident, you can pick up that guide and walk it through with the student, and you'll really have everything you need to fill out those applications successfully as you're assisting students. We also have toolkits for our high school counselors to give them information about the special considerations when supporting these two student populations. And again, as we've mentioned, our webinar from today will be posted on the website and easily accessible for the future. So we have the link there on the slide if you want to click it, type it in, bookmark it, and save it as we update our materials in the coming weeks. Next slide. We also have a great new guide for, those of you who are supporting youth in the foster care system. We have these step-by-step post-secondary education planning guides, and we have one version for adult supporters assisting students in middle school and high school with, everything they need to do to plan for post-secondary education. And we also have a youth-facing version for our high school students, one for our 9th to 11th graders and one specifically for our 12th graders to give them all the information they need to plan and prepare for post-secondary education. Those are available now in English and Spanish. They have downloadable checklists, embedded student spotlight videos, and we also have a website, californiacollegepathways.org, where these materials additionally live, as well as all kinds of information about post-secondary education for youth involved in the foster care system. And we also want to leave you with some additional resources. We have a lot of great resources for homeless youth. If you go to our partners website at Schoolhouse Connection, they've got everything you need to know for that student population, sample verification letters, screening tools, flow charts. So that's a great resource we recommend. Also, the National Center for Homeless Education has a lot of great resources. And then on the right-hand side are a list of general resources. I Can Go to College includes a lot of information at the community college system, including financial aid. NCAN has a lot of general information about filling out the new FAFSA. We also have a resource for those of you serving justice-involved youth, as well as Immigrants Rising has a lot of great resources for undocumented students. Next slide. And if you want to practice, you want to dive in, get familiar with the new application, they have launched a FAFSA preview website where you can go on. There's a prototype of the new application, and you can go to that link and type in the access code, and you can click through the new application if you want to practice or just get more familiar with what the new application is going to look like. So with that, we have time for some questions and answers. I know there have been hundreds of questions submitted here in the Q&A chat, and we've been responding to those throughout the webinar, but we do want to spend a little bit of time opening up to respond to some of the additional questions that have come up, and I will turn it over to Debbie to facilitate that.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, gosh, we have a lot of questions coming in. Trying to kind of pull out some that might be of interest. I will just reiterate one thing, which is that we will be making the PowerPoint and recording available. We've had some questions about whether we're going to compile the Q&A and send that out. I think that that is something we can do. That might take us a few additional days beyond when we send out the recording, but we'll try to work on that. Mark or David, we had a few questions early on about if a student already has an FSA ID from filing the FAFSA this year or previous year, can they continue to use that existing FSA ID? I think, Mark, you were answering that in the chat. If you want to unmute.
they can use their existing FSA ID. They may need to update the password because the password's only good for up to 18 months. Also, the new FAFSA is going to be doing two-factor authentication. So they may need to verify their email address or their mobile phone number in order to have, so that they, when they use the FSA ID, there's going to be a 6-digit code sent to them. Alternatively, they could use an authenticator app. There are 3 that have been named so far: Dual Mobile, Google Authenticator, and Microsoft Authenticator. And finally, there is going to be what's called a backup code, but I believe you need to have one of those 3 methods that I mentioned: an email address, phone, mobile phone number, or authenticator app in order to use that FSA ID.
Thank you. And then Jessica, I'm going to pose this question to you. For a student to qualify as a foster youth, do they have to be in an out-of-home placement?
Yeah, so if you're working with someone who's in family maintenance, for example, but they're still living at home in the custody of their parents, they would not qualify unless they were removed from the home as a dependent of the court at least 1 day after the age of 13.
Great. We did have a couple of questions about the data match that we talked about between CDSS and CSAC to help verify foster care status. I am going to put a link in the chat right now. This is a document that we put together at JBay that talks more about where that information exists, how financial aid officers access it, and what happens when they cannot do the verification. Jessica, a question for you about the expanded SSCG. So is this money available in addition to the expanded Cal Grant that foster youth can already receive?
Yes, so it adds up. So a student might be able to receive the Cal Grant Access Award for foster youth, which is up to $6,000 for non-tuition costs, in addition to the Student Success Completion Grant if they're taking 12 or more units, which would be $10,500 on top of that. So lots of funding.
Great. Jillian, there's a question that I'm hoping you can take on. We've had a lot of questions sort of about what about this circumstance, what about that circumstance, and many of them are situations that don't fall, the student is neither in foster care, guardianship, or they don't meet the definition of homelessness, but they, you know, are estranged from their parents in some way. I wonder if you can kind of reiterate the information about unusual circumstances.
Yeah, happy to do so. So again, if a student is not a former had experiences in the foster youth system, and they're not an unaccompanied homeless youth or unaccompanied and at risk of homelessness and self-supporting, but they cannot provide that parental information, they would answer yes to those unusual circumstances, and they would reach out to their financial aid administrator, that office, and explain their situation and see if they could go through filling out the FAFSA as a provisional independent student. So they would not need to include parental information. They would go through something, perhaps a dependency override with the financial aid administrator, and the financial aid administrator might ask for some supporting documentation, whether that's from maybe teachers, counselors, doctors, clergy folks, and that can help the financial aid administrator make that professional judgment call.
Great. So David or Mark, I'm going to put a question to you. You know, there are some programs where, for example, EOPS, where if a student has a disability, they're given some exceptions. Say if there's a full-time unit requirement, they can enroll in the program with just 9 units or something to that effect. If a student is on a reduced course load because of a disability, does that give them any additional access to financial aid, or are they still subject to the same unit requirements for the financial aid categories?
My understanding is that they aren't, if they're enrolled half-time because of their disability, they aren't treated as though they were enrolled full-time. I know there was some controversy over this a while ago, but the Department of Education came out and said that enrollment status can't be changed due to a disability status. It's not like when you're taking the SAT or ACT and you're disabled, you can get more time, and they don't allow that.
But there are some
Great.
situations where if there are extenuating circumstances which may have impacted their satisfactory progress with the SAP, they should be in touch with the financial aid office. For example, during COVID, there were students that were not able to access transportation, and colleges made an exception for those kinds of situations, Debbie.
Great, thank
Debbie,
you.
if I can point out,
yeah.
can I point out
Yeah.
one other thing? And that is there have been
Yeah, please.
several requests for fact tip sheets from JBay and the FSA ID tip sheet from Mark. Should people go to the jbay.org site for your fact sheets?
So we will send out some links in the follow-up email to everybody with the fact sheets that are currently available. So look for that coming in your email.
Okay, Mark, one other question. The FSA ID tip sheet, how can people access that, the one you created?
Okay, it's available on my website, studentaidpolicy.com. It's towards the top of that. It's one of the first links, and it's free. You just click on that link and you can access it. I think I put it in the chat here too.
Mark, I think the other thing that's in that tip sheet, as I remember, is there is information there for parents who do not have social security numbers and how they can get an FSA ID. It's probably the only site I've seen in addition to what the Department of Education has produced.
Yes.
Great. I want to just mention a comment that somebody just put in the chat. It is so important for students to log into WebGrants and verify their school of attendance. If they don't confirm their school, they don't show up on the Cal Grant roster, and financial aid will not know they are eligible for the SSCG. So make sure students are updating that information in WebGrants once they know what school they're going to be attending. Jessica, a question for you. If a student has been in foster care and is also experiencing homelessness, how do they fill out that section of the FAFSA?
So the first questions they'll be asked will be the ones that ask if they've been in the foster care system, and we would definitely advise that they answer those questions. I think generally it can be a lot easier to get that verification since for most students it is automated. So I would encourage them to first, answer those questions, and they'd be able to get independent status through that way.
Right, and they can check all that apply. So there's no reason they can't indicate both foster care and homeless status.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Let's see, what are some of the other questions here? If anybody else has kind of noticed a question coming in from multiple people, feel free to chime in with that.
Debbie, we got a couple of questions because the FAFSA will no longer contain information about whether the student's residence plans, the student's campus housing status. Mark or Jessica, might you want to address that and how colleges are handling that? Because I think it varies by segmental, by the type.
It varies by college. Some colleges are using the information they have, whether the student is living in on-campus housing. And if the student isn't living on on-campus housing, they will change the student's housing status to either be off-campus in an apartment or off-campus with family. And that will affect the amount of financial aid the student's eligible for, because many colleges use the food and housing, which used to be called room and board, component of the cost of attendance. They have a lower figure for students who aren't living in campus housing.
Great, thank you. And there have been some, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to respond to another question in the chat.
Oh, okay. There have been some requests for the link for the FAFSA prototype. So I just went ahead and put that in the chat. So you can grab that. And
So,
I think we're actually, oh, sorry, go ahead. One more question, go ahead.
Yeah, there was one question that came in, and I'm glad it did because I failed to mention this, is how do those community colleges know to identify their foster youth for the Student Success Completion Grant? So there's a few strategies that we would recommend that colleges utilize. One is they can look at their existing list for the Cal Grant B Foster Youth Access Award. Most students should show up on that list, but not all. It is possible that some may not be captured on that. So another option would be to work with your Next Step program. All of our community colleges have a foster youth support program called Next Step. Highly recommend partnering with them. They can go through and audit their students to see who might be eligible, who should be eligible, to make sure that all potential students have been identified. Another tip would be the California Community College application, CCC Apply, has a question where students can self-identify if they've ever been in foster care. That's a great opportunity to proactively let students know what the criteria is to be eligible, that they may be eligible, and to provide them information. And so I think if students look at, colleges look at those rosters, also their Chafee Grant roster, or the roster that shows who qualifies for independent status on the FAFSA, that should capture most students. But again, we need our colleges to be proactive and diligent to make sure that none of our potential eligible students are slipping through the cracks that could be receiving, about $10,000 from this aid.
There's also a question that came in about whether, is it true that the work study question is no longer going to appear on the FAFSA? And the answer to that question is yes, that is correct. That question will no longer appear on the 24-25 FAFSA.
All right, and with that, I think we're at time. So glad we got to cover some of those questions out loud, but we will be providing some follow-up. I'm sure people couldn't track all the Q&A. I couldn't track it coming in. There was a lot of it. So really appreciate everybody who joined us today. Thank you. Ooh, look at all the fun clappies and hearts and, and thumbs up. That makes us feel great. Thank you. And stay tuned, more resources to come in January from JBay once the new FAFSA is out and we can confirm what it looks like. So fun times ahead for all. Have a great rest of your day.